Hi guys, it's Danny. Alrighty, today we're gonna discuss about what we should do if somehow we manage to get our orchids out of their pots and their media. And this idea was actually suggested by my boyfriend, who actually managed to bump over the orchid that I left him this summer, or I don't know, somehow it fell, and he was very concerned that the orchid will die. And I totally get this, because most people think that if plants are not in their pot and in their media, in their soil, they need to be addressed immediately because they will die. Well, funny thing, orchids are not like that. The vast majority of orchids, particularly Phalaenopsis orchids, are epiphytes. In their natural habitat, they grow in air. They don't need this media that we provide. Actually, the media we use is just here to make our life easier. And of course, it isn't the benefit of the orchid, but it doesn't really need it to survive. So let's address a few instances of what can actually happen when you bump over an orchid and what we should do. So luckily I have here an orchid that managed to fall, and as you can see, she's not very stable in her pot. Now, usually you kind of need to address this at some point. I choose not to because in a few months I'll have to unpot all of my orchids and actually send them over to a different country, so I cannot take the media and everything, so I just don't bother. But if you manage to bump over the orchid and remove it from its pot, you kind of need to address it. Now, if you are in that time of day where you're in a hurry, you need to go to work or something, you don't need to address it right away. You don't even need to address it in that particular day or the next day. Somewhere in the next few days, you should address it. So let's presume your orchid fell, but there's no damage. No leaves were broken, nothing got snapped from the orchid. It just came out of the pot and all the roots are in the air. Don't worry, it's not gonna die because orchids don't need to be in soil actually, but you do kind of need to place it in its pot once again. The only reason for this is that in the air the roots will dry much faster, especially if you have, let's say, a typical normal environment where air is not very humid. They will dehydrate faster. So keeping the roots that were in the media, again back in the media, will actually provide moisture to the orchid and it will keep it from being dehydrated. But that's pretty much the only reason. The orchid really will not mind that it's in the air. This is how it grows naturally, so don't worry about that. Now, if the media inside the pot is brand new, you don't need to change the media. You can definitely reuse it. But if you have this orchid in this media for 2 or 3 years, it's a good opportunity to actually change the media and provide some fresh media. So actually you can go through a normal repotting procedure whenever you have the time to devote to your orchid. So to conclude, if your orchid comes out of the pot and you really need to rush to work, just go to work. Don't worry about the orchid because she will be just fine. Just repot it and rearrange it in the next few days just to keep it hydrated. Even if a few roots will snap or break, that's pretty fine as well, especially if your orchid has a lot of roots. A few roots being snapped or broken will probably not mean too much in the sense of health for this orchid, particularly with Phalaenopsis. If a root kind of snaps, it doesn't mean it's gonna die. It can actually continue growing because the root itself of an orchid is the stringy thing you see here. It's not the outer coating, let's say. So if the outer coat snaps, like you see here, doesn't mean the root will die. As you can see, the root is perfectly fine even if it snapped. So again, don't worry about that. But in some cases, some bad things can happen as well when you bump over orchids. Leaves might break, and if too many leaves break, that's not really okay for the orchid. Leaves are, let's say, the kitchen of the orchid. This is where its food is being produced, and the leaves actually feed the entire plant. So if you have a leaf or two that broke, because the leaves don't necessarily survive if they're snapped, you can actually cut it with a sterile scissors and actually apply a bit of cinnamon on the cut wound. I do have a video on how to sterilize these wounds so you don't get some infections. You can check it out in the info card right here, and yeah, you'll learn more about this process. Another thing that can happen if the orchid was in bloom or it had a flower spike is to actually break the flower spike. And this is actually really not cool. It will, however, not mean your orchid will die or will suffer. Breaking of flower spikes doesn't really affect the health of the orchid. It just affects you emotionally because you do want to see the flowers of your orchid. Now, in this case, depends where the flower spike actually breaks. You can opt for a few actions. If the flower spike breaks at the tip, you don't need to do anything because the flowers you still got left will still continue to be there. The spike can actually branch out. It just depends on the orchid, but if somehow you manage to break it, let's say somewhere before the flowers start, you can actually cut the flower spike above a node. And to better explain this, I'll add in an info card again right here a video I made on how to cut flower spikes. Of course, depending on what you want. So you will see there how to cut a Phalaenopsis flower spike above a node. This can sometimes induce the orchid into producing a branch or two. It doesn't always happen, but it's worth a try if you didn't manage to enjoy the blooms of your orchid because of this incident. Now, in the case of sympodial orchids, particularly Oncidium orchids, you kind of need to address this issue a bit faster than in the case of a Phalaenopsis. Just because these type of orchids really like moisture, and if they stay dry for too long, you will notice the pseudobulbs starting to shrivel. If you disturb the roots a little bit, the pseudobulbs again will start to shrivel a little bit, but again, it doesn't mean it will die. Just address it the next day or in the evening of that day, and practically you should be just fine, even with Oncidium orchids. Now, in the case of Oncidium orchids, if flower spikes break, well, tough luck. They just break. They don't really branch out. So what I told you with cutting the spike above a node does not apply to Oncidium orchids all the time. They do branch sometimes, but it's really not the same thing as a Phalaenopsis. They don't branch out from the nodes on the lower part of the orchid that you see. Anyway, if you manage to break the spike of an Oncidium, well, that's that. But the orchid might produce another flower spike from the other side of the pseudobulb. And to finish this idea, it's not always pleasant to bump over your orchids and get them out of the pots. For this reason, you can actually use decorative pots or ceramic pots to keep them in place. Media of orchids is really light, and it's really easy to bump them over. This is an example. That orchid over there was never bumped ever since I started to use the decorative container. So just keep that in mind. Orchids are really light, they're really prone to falling, so use a sort of a decorative container or other means of stabilizing your plants so you don't go through the trouble of actually breaking anything. But it's really not the end of the world. You can have other stuff that can happen which are far worse than this, and this is spider mite damage. But if you just bump over the pot, that's really not a reason to panic. The orchid will most likely not die. 99% of the times it will not die unless it actually breaks all of her leaves and stuff like that. But that doesn't really happen. So alrighty, thank you for watching this video. Hope you found it useful. If you liked it, give it a thumbs up and a share. Subscribe to my channel for daily orchid videos, and also feel free to leave me in the comments below suggestions or questions you might have, and I'll get back to you. If you click on the left side of your screen, you'll be directed to orchidnature.com, where you'll find care sheets, identification sheets, and also you can talk to us in the forum section. And on the right side of your screen, you can click to watch a video about Phalaenopsis orchids. Thank you for joining. I'll see you next time. Bye!